Ladies and gentlemen, let me also join, though it's late in the day, in welcoming you to SEPA and to Columbia University. And I know it's been a rich day of brainstorming, and I'm delighted to be part of it towards the end of the day. We're less than 2 weeks to the Paris conference now, since those in climate change have been talking about Paris for 5 years now. It's getting close, and most of us feel that it's the last chance to reach a serious agreement on climate. Obviously, the world's not in a good place right now, and the disaster in Paris has shaken everybody and will absorb a huge amount of human and political energy in the next 2 weeks. But what is encouraging is that the world is rallying to the climate conference also to show solidarity with Paris. I'm just back last evening from the G20 meeting, which was in Antalya, Turkey, and all of the G20 leaders pledged to be in Paris a week from next Monday on November 30th to show solidarity with France at this moment, and also to show their commitment to the climate change agenda. I wouldn't say necessarily that all of the G20 are gung-ho on climate change, but I do think that it's true to say that nobody wants to stand as the blockade right now, which by itself is a major political change. I think in their hearts, every leader knows that we're really up against the wall. And while this is probably a politician's least favorite issue, because it's nothing but pain, actually, in the short term, pain in the neck, nuisance, pain against powerful lobbies, pain against the status quo, pain in the short term for gain in the long term, and so on. My sense of the politicians is that they're actually ready. And interestingly, those who weren't so ready, like Mr. Abbott and Mr. Harper, are gone. Bravo. Not a partisan remark, but just a happy one. So it got a little bit better just in recent weeks. And it was a delight to see Prime Minister Trudeau at the summit. He brings a breath of wonderful fresh air and definitely commitment to a cause that on which Canada has been basically silent and foot-dragging for 20 years. So we're 2 weeks away, and I thought I would talk about where we stand on actually getting something done. Now, I'm sure that all of you have viewed pictures like this frequently in the last years. This is the temperature climate anomaly for September 2015. In other words, the difference of current temperature from an average over a 30-year period that NOAA uses as a baseline. And you see basically a world almost entirely in red, meaning anomalous warming compared to the mean values from the 50s to the 80s. And we know that this year will be the hottest year in instrument record. Almost, well, I would say very likely, the hottest year in thousands of years. There is some debate about the early Holocene temperatures starting 10,000 years ago. But this is a very, very warm year, and it's also a year of a lot of climate destabilization. And for the climate skeptics, so-called, who nonsensically said for many years that warming had stopped, well, warming hasn't stopped. We're breaking all records, and if they say, well, yes, this is an El Nino year, which adds to the temperature, which it is, they had deliberately obscured the fact that their previous point, that 1998 was the hottest year, was also an El Nino year. So they're phony baloney, basically, the climate skeptics. It's a bunch of nonsense which takes away our time from global urgency. and it's been a disgrace. And the remaining disgrace is two places. One is the US Congress, which is paid and owned by the oil lobby until now. And second, the Wall Street Journal editorial page, which is our best daily fiction. And complete irresponsibility. This is a warming world. It's warming fast. It's warming dramatically. It is extremely threatening. And we have a last chance even at a handhold of safety. This is a picture that NASA recently released showing using bathymetry to show what would happen to inhabited land areas were the sea level to rise by 6 meters. And of course, it would be pretty depressing for this conference because we would have to arrive by a boat from the window. Maybe we'd have to be on the top floor. But Manhattan would be devastated, as would cities all over the world. And Bangladesh would basically, with its 100 million people, be unable to survive, and many other parts of the world. Why 6 meters? 6 meters is an estimate. 4 to 6 meters is the estimate of the sea level height compared to the current level that existed the last time Earth was about 2 degrees warmer than the pre-industrial level, which was 130,000 years ago in a geologic age called the Eemian. It was the interglacial preceding our current interglacial, which is known as the Holocene. And when the Earth was about 2 degrees warmer than the pre-industrial, current pre-industrial level, that means around the year 1800, 130,000 years ago, the sea level was 4 to 6 meters higher than it is today. And we're heading for that temperature and more. So we're heading for a temperature that we haven't seen on the planet for more than 100,000 years. And when we were at that temperature, all life was different. There was no civilization. Of course, Homo sapiens had just appeared in their niche in Africa, and sea levels were far higher. And since civilization began 10,000 years ago, we have thought it clever, and it has been clever, to build all our great cities on the coast, because that's where you trade, and that's where you engage in international exchange, and that's where you can be most productive. And those are the places that would find themselves devastated by this kind of sea level rise. Why would the sea level rise? Of course, it's because the two great ice sheets would contribute meters of sea level increase. The breakup of the West Antarctic ice sheet, which is now underway in particular parts of West Antarctica, and the loss of mass from Greenland, which is also underway now. What the scientists can't tell from this paleoclimate record or from the current climatology is the timestamp on the breakup of these ice sheets. But we are flirting with disaster from this. And this is just one of the very many effects of climate change that will come if we have runaway temperature increases, even modest temperature increases. This is the famous graph of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which I think is very important for everybody to understand. These are 4 scenarios, so-called RCPs, or reference concentration pathways, and they show different paths of carbon emissions, which are measured on the vertical axis. You see in the dotted black dots on the left of the graph the actual level of emissions. And what you see is that as of roughly 2013, the emissions are at about 10 on this vertical axis. That's 10 petagrams, or 10 billion tons of carbon emitted. And if you convert 10 billion tons of carbon to tons of carbon dioxide, that's about 35 billion tons 36 billion tons actually, of CO2 emitted currently. And that's overwhelmingly from fossil fuel use, from coal, oil, and gas. The two upper trajectories during the 21st century are trajectories in which mitigation fails. And what they show is that the climate ensemble models estimate a rise of temperatures from 3 degrees C up to above 6 degrees C. And remember, 2 degrees C, all meaning relative to the 1800 Earth temperature, I remind you, is enough to break up the ice sheets on some timestamp. And it's also enough to cause devastating changes of ecosystems, drying, massive droughts, failure of precipitation. I better turn off my phone, excuse me. That's my wife and grandchildren calling. I'll see them later. Droughts, floods, rising sea level, of course, heat waves, temperature stress, thermal stress on crops beyond anything that we have designed our crops to withstand, and so forth. The lower two RCPs are mitigation scenarios. The lowest line is what we're aiming for, supposedly, if we want to keep temperatures below 2 degrees C. 2 degrees C is the international agreed guardrail or ceiling for warming that was adopted back in Copenhagen in 2009 and then confirmed in Cancun in 2010. It is regarded as the last relatively safe level of global temperature. But for the reasons of the graph just shown before, our lead climate guru at Columbia University, Professor James Hansen, rejects the idea that even 2 degrees C is safe, because he says 2 degrees C is plainly a part of a scenario of complete change of Earth's surface, breakup of ice sheets, rising sea levels, and much more. And he points out that we've never had 2 degrees C during the entire 10,000 years of the Holocene. So to achieve 2 degrees C is really hard. We have to be on the lower trajectory. Look at what that lower trajectory of emissions implies. Most importantly, it implies 0 by the second half of the 21st century. It implies full decarbonization of the world's energy system so that we have a fighting chance to stay below 2 degrees C. Now, this reference pathway, the lower one, only gives a 2/3 probability of remaining below 2 degrees C. So the point is, you do everything, make a massive transformation, and we're still not assured safety, both because 2 degrees might not be right and because climate sensitivity might be such that in any event we're pushed above 2 degrees C. This is hard. And that's why wasting 20 years and reading the nonsense that we do and having the idiotic, corrupt Congress that we do is really not a joke for us, ladies and gentlemen. It's not a joke. This is not a game. This is the only planet we have. This isn't experimenting with a little piece of the planet. This is the whole story. And we know enough to know that this is serious. Really serious. And is it sure? No, it's not sure. Is the science certain? As much as any science, the science is certain. We've known that for about 130 years, that carbon dioxide absorbs infrared and warms the planet. That's not a mystery. And Svante Arrhenius in 1896 already made very sound calculations of what a doubling of CO2 would mean. So the science is not uncertain. The parameters are uncertain in terms of feedbacks. Is that grounds for complacency? Is that grounds for waiting? Is that grounds for saying, why are we worrying about this, which the Wall Street Journal editorial page does daily? Absolutely the contrary. It is a disgrace, what we've been doing for the last 20 years. A complete disgrace. So what do we know about staying below that, staying on that lower trajectory? That is a trajectory to get out of fossil fuels, except for the small amount of fossil fuels that remain paired with carbon capture and storage. That's what that scenario means. It's called decarbonization. That's what's called for. Not changing coal to gas, but changing coal to wind, solar, geothermal, hydro, nuclear, or carbon capture and sequestration. The rest is phony. We can fake it, explain it to my grandchildren. I don't want to. I don't want us to fake it. I want us to get it right. So to know what it means to get it right, you integrate under that lower curve because that tells you the cumulative amount of carbon that can be emitted and still have a 2/3 chance of staying below 2 degrees C. And that is estimated to be about 900 billion tons CO2 remaining in the carbon budget for a likely, i.e. 2/3 chance of remaining below 2 degrees C. It's not good because we're emitting 35 billion a year. So it's under 30 years at the current rate to have even a 2/3 chance of staying below this target. We need to move, clearly. What does that mean for the fossil fuel producers? Nothing good. It means that we have more proven reserves by far than we can ever use. Mostly coal, but also oil and gas. So that's a simple arithmetic calculation. Painful for ExxonMobil, or for Chevron, or for Saudi Aramco, or for the Middle East, or for the Canadian oil sands. Painful. But what are you going to do about it? Nothing? Or actually do something? And what it means to do is to recognize that we can't use all of these proven reserves. The best single paper on this came out in Nature this January, a paper by Ekins and McGlade at University College London, which asked a straightforward question. Suppose we live within the carbon budget for the 2 degrees C likely scenario. And suppose we do that in an efficient way, meaning using the lowest cost fossil fuels that we have, taking into account regional availability and transport costs. And then they asked, if we do that and make a transition to zero carbon energy during a 50-year period to stay within the 2 degrees C budget, what does that imply for what stays under the ground of today's reserves? And they came up with this table. And basically what it means is that globally 80% of the coal that is already in reserves stays under the ground. For gas, it's about half. And for oil, it's about 33%, 1/3, stays under the ground. And then you can see where that is. Basically, high-cost energy sources that also are especially high carbon content per unit of energy are stranded. And that's why coal is stranded first. There's just no place for coal in a 2 degrees C world, except if CCS is widely deployed or is deployed in the particular places where coal exists. Otherwise, coal does not have a place in a 2 degrees C world. And I think it's no coincidence that our entire coal industry in the US is going bankrupt right now, because that is actually compatible with what we would want to happen to stay within the carbon budget. We want that to happen not in the sense of its social impact, because it would not be hard for us to have a compensatory action vis-a-vis the 32,000 actual coal miners that remain in this country, mind you, out of a labor force of 150 million people. 32,000. So this is not about the coal miners. At this point, it's barely about the coal owners also. They've lost almost all their money. But it is about the future scenario of the energy sector. What does it imply that we have to strand so much of assets? It implies, first of all, that we ought not be drilling for new assets, especially in high-cost, difficult places. There is no case that I can see for the life of me for drilling in the Arctic right now. Why would we drill in the Arctic when we already have enough proved reserves to use at much lower cost and much greater safety? Why would we be exploring in the ultra-deep sea for the same reason? It's also a case why the Keystone decision was obvious, right, and if you had invested in Keystone, it would have gone bankrupt anyway at some point, because in 5 or 10 or 15 years, we would stop the throughput through Keystone once we have enough disasters to understand that this is no joke, this is the real thing, and we don't actually need the oil sands in this way. If Canada wants to develop the oil sands, it should develop them for electricity use in Canada with carbon capture and sequestration alongside. That's the only safe use of them that I could see. So that's the political difficulty, which is we have very powerful interests. I would say the most powerful single lobby in the world in the last century, still powerful today, that owns a lot of these assets. They're not used to losing. This is an amazing industry, the oil industry. It will go anywhere to get oil. It's about the most capable industry I've ever seen. It will go to the deep sea, it will go to the Arctic, it will go to the middle of the jungle, it'll go to the middle of the desert. Nothing stops it. If the government isn't right, change the government. If the Congress isn't right, change the Congress. But this game has to stop right now because we can't continue that way. And I think most places in the world are waking up to this. Well, what to strand is one part of this, and what to do is another part. Because I don't think anybody that looks at a modern economy says other than we need a lot of energy. Because energy inputs are vital for quality of life. And so the issue is not to stop electrification. The issue is not even to cut decisively our energy use, though we should be more efficient and can be more efficient. The issue is to mobilize alternative energy, zero carbon energy. Fortunately, the plate of technological options is really already quite good and getting vastly better. And if we put a little thought to it, it would get better at a greatly accelerated rate, because we know that we're on the verge of major breakthroughs in key low and zero carbon technologies. So one project that I've been promoting at the UN is a project we call the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project. And that is a project to examine what actual pathways to decarbonization would look like. Not in economist black box models, but in very transparent technology terms. I'm not a big fan of saying, well, let's just put a price on carbon and see what happens. Because not much will happen, by the way, if that's the only thing we do. To make an energy transition requires a public policy framework for land use, for liability, for regulatory change. It's a complicated strategy. energy is right at the core of our economy. And it's only a semi-market commodity because it's filled with regulation for a lot of very good reasons, including public safety, including land use, including the relations of energies to ecosystem functions, including social implications of alternative energy strategies. So we need a framework, and we haven't had a clear framework. We don't have in the United States an energy plan, for example. Why? Because the lobbies would, because the administration has felt that the lobbies would eat it up. I think that's a miscalculation in my view. I think the only way to lead is by leading to show what can be done. And I think it's a mistake that the United States does not have a white paper on decarbonized energy in the United States. You cannot find it anywhere. We had a Nobel laureate Secretary of Energy. We have a brilliant Secretary of Energy today. They could do this overnight, by the way, but they're not allowed to. So we don't have the guidance of what this kind of transformation should really look like. So in the interests of public awareness at the UN, we've done this for the 15 major emitting countries to show what actual pathways would look like. What they show is that for any country in the world, there are 3 pillars to deep decarbonization. One is energy efficiency, which is possible. That means basically substituting capital for energy through better building structures, for example, for insulation, or through smart metering and smart grids to reduce energy per unit of effective output. The second is to decarbonize the electricity grid. This is very important because electricity is crucial for any successful decarbonization strategy. We're shifting often from direct fossil fuel burning, for example, under the hood of an internal combustion engine automobile, to an electric vehicle or to a hydrogen vehicle where the hydrogen is produced by electricity, by hydrolysis. And so whatever we're going to do, almost surely we're going to need zero carbon electricity. By the way, not natural gas electricity cleaner than coal. That doesn't even come close to what needs to be done. We need to go from, say, a kilogram per kilowatt hour CO2 emission from a coal plant, not to 500 grams in a natural gas plant, but to 50 or 70, and eventually down to 0 grams per kilowatt hour delivered. And so we need to get to wind, solar, geothermal, hydro, nuclear, and CCS. And maybe a few niches of biomass, although I have my doubts in most places because of the competition of the biomass with ecosystem services and food supply. So that's the list. If you know of others, mention it, but there aren't too many others. I don't think any of those on the list should be off the list. It would be foolhardy, in my view, to say, okay, we're going to do this, but without nuclear and CCS. And I think the environmental community should be as serious about climate as it says it is by recognizing that rather ideologically driven opposition to nuclear has to be rethought because the idea that there are just wonderful, easy options around is not correct. We have a portfolio of options. They are not simple, and they're going to take time to implement, and I personally would not hold any of the major options off the table right now on an ex-ante basis because this is not so simple. The third pillar is what's called fuel switching. And it's basically to convert from direct burning of fossil fuels to some kind of clean fuel, whether it's a hydrogen fuel cell or direct use of electricity. So the Wall Street Journal asks once a week or so, are they going to tell us what kind of cars to drive? And the answer is yes, which is that we all should drive Teslas. I don't know what could be better than that, by the way, or more fun. And we should all drive vehicles that do not emit at the tailpipe. There are, incidentally, a few technologies being developed for the car to capture its own CO2, and then when it pumps at the filling station with regular petrol, it puts the CO2 down at the station, which then gets part of a CCS network. So there are many possible devices for getting to zero. But the idea that we've had that, well, we'll see someday in the future, or Exxon's idea, we don't really believe you can do 2 degrees and so forth. This is what has to be eliminated. Now, we're releasing in a couple of days, actually, a pathway for the United States, which is a detailed technology-based pathway to show how the transformation can be done. More accurately, we're releasing a set of pathways because we do a pathway without nuclear and CCS, all renewables, mixed scenarios, and so forth. If you take nuclear and CCS off the table, you can still do it. It's just a lot more costly. So you have to assess risks, balance public preferences, liability, and so forth to try to understand. It's not a matter just of setting a price on carbon. We're not going to decide the future of the nuclear industry by putting a carbon price on. That, in a way, can help the accounting and so forth, but it's not going to settle the question for our country, which is a public policy choice, of how we want to view the nuclear industry or how we want to view the power grid in the United States. Whether we want to build out an interstate power grid that brings winds from the Dakotas or solar from the Mojave Desert and so forth. These are policy choices, not simply pricing choices. But the point is that it's absolutely possible to achieve deep decarbonization, but it's not simple, and it requires an improvement of technologies over time. It doesn't require any technology that is not currently deployed at small scale. But with a massive upscaling of technologies, it does require vastly improved systems performance. Electric vehicles don't win the market right now because the battery performance is not yet adequate. But with an improved battery performance, they will. And they must. And I believe we should not be even foreseeing any continuation of personal mobility vehicles, whether it's cars or some alternative based on internal combustion engine sales after 2030. And we should make that clear to the companies. If you want to survive after 2030, you'll be selling, at least for personal vehicles, only electric or fuel cell or other zero-emission vehicles. They could do it. Absolutely, but it's a massive industrial overhaul, and it requires improved technological specifications. So what would be a meaningful agreement 2 weeks from now in view of all of this? I would put the following points for my preferred agreement. First, that the governments in the preamble and in the opening text say that just as the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change 23 years ago at Rio said that the purpose of this was to stabilize greenhouse gases to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system, that we're going to implement that by setting a 2 degrees C upper limit and perhaps move that down as scientific evidence on ice sheets and other impacts comes along. So that would be number one. Second, that we would recognize the carbon budget that is consistent with staying within a 2 degrees C or even a 1.5 degrees C world. Third, politically, we will have to continue with differentiated responsibilities. This has been a contentious point ever since the treaty was signed. I won't elaborate on this except to say that we signed a treaty in 1992 that said common but differentiated responsibilities, and then the US Senate in 1997 in the Hagel-Byrd Amendment rejected differentiated responsibilities and created the impasse that's been with us now for 18 years. Because China said, what do you mean no differentiated responsibilities? Look at the clear words of the treaty. You're an Annex I country, we're not. And that was the whole basis for the agreement in 1992. So the US reneged on the treaty in 1997. The US Senate reneged on the treaty. And this has been a stalemate since then. The stalemate is being broken because China's saying now, which it has to say, let's move forward. It said up until now, you move forward, we'll come later. But now that China is much richer and is now the world's leading greenhouse gas emitting economy by far, twice the US emissions in the aggregate, 1/2 per capita, and because China is highly vulnerable to climate change, China is now saying we move forward. But this issue of differentiation remains a very, very difficult spot on the negotiations, and mainly because the US reneged on this commitment that it had signed in 1992. The fourth point is we need policy statements, and we have one called the Intended Nationally Determined Contributions, INDCs, and my colleagues and I are advocating for another one to be included in the treaty to have every country commit to showing a deep decarbonization path to 2050 as well as the INDC to 2030. So we're hoping that the final agreement will have language about mid-century paths, not legally binding, but mid-century paths. And the US and China have both agreed to this concept, which is exciting, because they are now both saying we need such pathways based on this work, in part. And in the recent communique between President Xi and President Obama, they called on other countries as well to put forward such mid-century pathways. I think it's extremely important because without them, politicians do not understand this issue. They think that this is small tweaking here and there. We'll do a little bit less coal, a little bit more solar. That's not what this is about. This is about decarbonizing the energy system, which is completely different. It's about deep transformation over a 50-year period, which is much harder than small incremental steps. And small incremental steps don't add up to large changes unless from the start you say, I know where we're going to zero by 2070 or 2080. Otherwise, you get caught in cul-de-sacs. Let's say we say we're going from coal to gas. All we're doing is building the next trap for ourselves. So you have to keep the long-term vision to know what the short-term transformations need to be. The fifth point is climate financing, another sorry story which I won't go into at length, except to say that the rich countries promised the poor countries climate financing, and then lo and behold, after doing almost nothing, they announced last month, you see, we're already giving you $60 billion of climate financing this year. And the poor countries scratched their head and said, you are? Show us. They haven't shown where the numbers come from, but they issued the report to say, you see, we're well on our way to our promise. What they're doing is counting anything they can of development aid as a climate project now, not incremental financing. It's really not good. Now, President Obama, I understand he can't get anything through this Congress in climate financing. But what the US has done up until now is to stop the conversation on it and hoping that somehow, despite the promise, we can do enough abracadabra on the numbers to just get an agreement. I don't think it's going to quite work that way. We have to have an agreement that is absolutely real about the climate financing. Then we need a global agreement on research and development to improve the low carbon energy technologies. Energy storage, smart grids, electric vehicles, fourth generation nuclear power, carbon capture and sequestration, improved photovoltaics, they would all be high on the list. I know I'm late. I'll finish in just a moment. There's a hope and a plan for non-state actors to come forward. The business sector will announce lots of commitments, which will be very good through the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. Cities will announce commitments under C40 and other initiatives. And finally, we're at the final stages, very difficult, of defining what it means for this to be legally binding and regularly updated. Because the US wants to say, we don't have to send this to Congress. I don't blame them. On the other hand, the rest of the world is saying we need a legally binding agreement. And if you've watched the press in recent days, this is a little bit of a mess. It would require, I believe, the US Senate to stand up to the whole rest of the world. I don't put it past them, but it would be especially disgraceful. I will leave one more chart. I don't have time to talk about it, but we talk about the road through Paris, not the road to Paris, because the Paris Agreement is just the start of a very long, further transformation. We need plans. We need to reintroduce the American people to the concept of planning, because we can't do this through the market alone. We actually have to think. And it's not only the private sector thinking, it's also the public sector thinking about this. We need to stop any new coal plants. I think that's going to happen in the US, but it has to happen worldwide, except for some low-income countries that are going to be given a little bit more time and space for this. We need to end drilling, as I said, in high-cost environments. We need to scale up R&D. Our cities need to start moving. Basically, much of the action is in building codes, smart grids, urban infrastructure, and the cities need to move, and the mayors are a lot more practical than national parliaments and congresses all over the world. And so that's where we're pinning a lot of hope. We should recapitalize the multilateral development banks like the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the Africa Development Bank, so they can provide real climate financing for the long term. And we should follow through and really create the Green Climate Fund. It exists, but it has almost no money in it right now. And so turning that into an instrument that can really contribute is important. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.